And reservoirs in Nebraska are incredibly important. Matter of fact, about 90% of all of our recreational fishing and boating occurs on reservoirs. So for Nebraska, that's a big thing. And just like Jeff showed you, the vast majority of reservoirs were built in the middle of the past century, and they've declined over time. And what we have now is we have a lot of old reservoirs, and quite honestly, one of our program is one of the oldest, and people thought, boy, you were really innovative. Well, quite honestly, we were a little concerned about our jobs and our recreational opportunities, because as those reservoirs declined, we knew that fishing quality declined. Fishing licenses were going to start going down as well. And so we, as biologists, were trying to experiment for a lot of years on trying to find ways to restore reservoir life, return to more of a fountain of youth type thing. And so that's what we've really worked on, and so that's what really kind of drove us to get moving on this program. My last presentation was a few weeks ago in England, and I was telling about Great Plains, so forgive me for just a bit of background, but what I really want to do is do three things. Talk about the problems we face in Nebraska, talk about the origination of our program, and then talk and actually show you some of the projects we're doing right now, some of the techniques we use, and things like that. Ag is big in the Great Plains, as you know. It's not just us, it's every place else. 88% of the Great Plains is now in ag production. Mostly row crops in the east. Like Mike said, they don't have much irrigation. You go to the western part of the plains, it's all irrigation. A lot of western Nebraska it depends an awful lot on irrigation for row crops. That farming is quite honestly, in the watersheds, has taken a pretty big toll. Either the intense tillage basically tore up that stabilizing blanket that we had on the plains, those prairies. They're very fragile, very fertile soils. We've ripped them apart and basically farmed them, obviously for a good reason, to feed people and things like that, but there's been a constant consequence to that. And in Nebraska and Iowa and most of the Great Plains, where we have a lot of row crop tillage, we've seen a lot of problems over the years. And even though cropping practices have greatly improved, you see a lot more no-till, you see that, those things have really improved a lot. Most of that damage has already been done. There's been tons upon tons of sediment and attached nutrients have been washed into our streams and our standing bodies of water. So we've got a huge backload of problems, even though we've changed a lot of our practices and improved them. And those things are continuing to haunt us, if you will. The nutrients that came in, the sediments usually bring in phosphorus and nitrogen. Those things reside there until they're exposed to air or water, and then all of a sudden they bloom. We have all kinds of problems like this. That upper right-hand corner is just a little sand pit. These are all homes around here, nice little beautiful area, but you can't get in the water. This bottom thing here, that's Lake Erie last year. Guys, if you know that, but last year the western half of Lake Erie basically had a huge algal bloom out of microsystem. So these are things that are watershed driven that go into these reservoirs and have a big part of it. Like I said, this is when the wheels kind of fall off of. These are major problems we've got to address. Like I said, reservoirs in Nebraska are incredibly important. And one of the reasons that a lot of reservoirs are built, especially in Nebraska, are for a lot of reasons, but primarily across the United States, middle of last century, most of them were built like Jeff showed. They were built for a lot of different purposes: drinking water, irrigation, flood control, hydropower. In Nebraska, it's basically irrigation is the entire western half of the state. Eastern part of the state, we have a lot more flood controls. But basically, irrigation to irrigate crops is the main purpose of all of our big reservoirs. These are where we're having a lot of these problems. And here's the problem now. As management biologists, we're kind of in an awkward situation because the industry, ag, irrigation stuff, that's causing a lot of our problems in these reservoirs is also the industry that created the infrastructure that are providing these fishing opportunities. So one thing we have to constantly balance is the primary purpose and reason for those reservoirs being out there and what we can make out of them. So we're constantly in competition for that primary purpose, whether it be irrigation, hydropower, flood control, things like that. And it's really been the fisheries angle, that's what our program has really kind of revolved around. Biologists have known about these problems since 30, 40 years ago, and most of our management agencies have tried to do individual projects trying to learn new techniques. And if you go back in the scientific literature, you can see over the years a new habitat technique for this, a new habitat technique for that. But it was really, the cry in Nebraska was, we see these water quality and reservoir conditions and fishing habitat going downhill as our reservoirs aged. And so our biologists knew it was critical that we went out and did something. So we started in the early 90s going out and traveling the state, just giving informational meetings, informing our anglers, if we had complaints, why is fishing bad in Reservoir X, we would start holding meetings and saying, hey, well, the reason is because you got, water quality issues, you got shoreline erosion, you got common carp problems, you got drawdowns for different reasons and things like that. Those are all contributing to that problem. And what those multiple conversations did over a couple of years is actually start driving some questions about not what was the problem, but what can be done about the problem. And that's where the opportunity to bring science and information biologists kind of entered that conversation. And so we started doing that, asking these people, what would you think would be a good way to try to address this? To really make this more of a public-driven opportunity. And so they started thinking, well, you know, you need to do something that's important. Okay, we want to make sure that we improve fishing. That's one of the main reasons we're here. Yeah, water quality would be nice. You know, more water supply, all those kind of things there. Well, that started to evolve into more of a conversation about a program or a way to do this, because we said we can do a lot of these things. We've done a lot of these projects one at a time. We think we've kind of got figured out some of these things. We just don't have a way to fund it. We don't have really a funding mechanism to do that. So that's when they started revolving about how do we get a set of money available to do that, and who should pay for that. Well, of course, general tax idea went completely out the window. They're not going to benefit from it. They're not going to supply it. So we kind of fell back on the old user pays system, which has been the foundation of most of conservation efforts in North America for a lot of years. And that was as well, gosh, these are anglers suggesting this, not us. The anglers are suggesting, well, how about if you increase our fee on our license? Okay, give us, and you use that money just to improve habitat. You guys, that's your biggest problem. How do we handle this? They started suggesting, yeah, we'll take a license fee. Yeah, I love fishing. I don't care if I pay an extra $5, $10, fine. If I get some benefits, I'll support it. And that's when they started talking about the stipulations, which was very, very important, because one of the concerns that everybody usually has is that if you increase funding to a state agency to do something, and you just throw it in their general budget, there's not a whole lot of accountability for that. And so to get support in Nebraska for this to happen, we actually had a real stipulation. They agreed and wanted to have an aquatic habitat stamp. That money had to be bought by all licensed anglers. Okay, that's the requirement they suggested. And then that money had to go separately, not into our general fund, not the normal stuff. It had to go into a separate fund all by itself. And the money coming out of that fund had to be very, very limited and directed. First of all, there had to be a plan put in place that identified what was going to be used, done, where. I mean, pre-approving locations and the type of work that was going to be done. Second, it had to get through an approval process through our legislature before they even released the dollars. And that's exactly what it came down to. We basically had to put those stipulations on a fund and a funding mechanism, and they had some very specific things they wanted to make sure we did not do. You know, Jeff and Mike said, you know, that when we go there and we talk about money, we're going to save our jobs. That's not the case. When this program was started, none of these funds could be used for people, personnel, our staff. We had to carve time out of our existing budget to go ahead and promote this program. So there was no administrative costs at all in the initial proposal. It could not be used to acquire property. Everything had to be turned around and used directly as fish habitat improvement projects only, nothing else. And it took a few years of doing that, those information meetings, but eventually we had enough legislators that actually introduced legislation to do just that. And in 1997, they created the $5 aquatic habitat stamp, required of all licensed anglers. That revenue went directly into an aquatic habitat fund in our state of Nebraska. It's a completely separate budget item. No dollars could be expended until we went through and put together a statewide plan on where we would work. We started off with 17 reservoirs we identified as high priority. We took it to our this committee, which is a legislative committee. Lo and behold, we now have 50 reservoirs or locations, which, by the way, is the exact same number of legislators we have in our unicameral. And after that, they said, okay, we'll go ahead and do it. They actually approved it. It got passed. Money started to accumulate. And we had to go through that rigmarole to get to the point where we actually had funding to do aquatic habitat projects. Start off at $5. To sum up, it's been reauthorized in 2008. We've got 100 new projects assigned to us, and the stamp then was $750. In 2010, they decided, gosh, we like what you're doing. We reauthorized you. Let's give you some more money. We're going to put an angler access program on top of it. It was in 2010 where they finally decided, you know what? Okay, we'll let you use enough money to pay for one guy to work to administer the program. That's my salary now. That's it. That's all we have. And I've got, like Mike, I've got a staff of 2, me and my assistant, and then we use our staff biologists in the districts, and they do all the work. And this was the logo that kind of caught him: to maintain, restore, and enhance the capacity of a water body to produce and sustain fish. Very angler-oriented, very recreational fishery driven. That's our state. Where we're at today, keep in mind Nebraska's pretty sparsely populated. We got 1.8 million residents, about 200,000 licensed anglers, and we've been able since 1997 to complete 90 different projects with a $57 million price tag. Over different 100 funding partnerships, and we now have about 10 to 15 projects that are going annually, and that's the main core of it, either planning a project, constructing a project, or finishing up a project. It's been a very important program for the state of Nebraska. It's done a lot of benefits, not just of aquatic habitat. It's actually benefited our agency a lot. Our agency, by virtue of being associated with this, gets a lot of positives from the recreational fishing side. And what we also learned too is that over time these anglers are very, very supportive of what we do. So even if we come out with a kind of a controversial fish regulation or something, they generally will give us the benefit of the doubt and let us at least explain ourselves before they jump on us and tell us to do it anyway. But it gets done. So here's just some examples of some projects in the last couple of years, and you can see these are smaller reservoirs, flood control reservoirs, and we get very involved around the entire shoreline, not just a little bit of it. We kind of address the problem. I'm going to kind of talk about that a little bit more now. But the partnerships is the main thing here. This little bit of dribble of money we get each year, about between $1.6 million a year of stamp funds itself, and then we actually use this with our own internal sport fish restoration funds. Now that you guys are recognizing that's probably your excise tax on your tackle, your equipment, and stuff like that. That provides about half of our funding for projects. The rest of it comes from granting situations, either federal, state, or just plain other. So we are able to leverage our stamp dollars 3 to 1, basically, which gives us a much larger operating budget. And that's just for aquatic habitat projects. That doesn't talk about new lake construction. Nebraska, we're building about 2 new reservoirs each year. And right now, our agency and my program is intimately involved with the design, and construction of every one of those reservoirs. We contribute some money, but basically that money is to make fish-friendly and boating-friendly features. That's our job now. There's a lot of multiple benefits. The other thing we know is that it pays off. And like I mentioned early on, there's no funding available for our program to spend for people other than myself. So we cannot use aquatic habitat dollars to evaluate our projects. That was forbidden. We had to use our base budget from our state program to do that. And we haven't done a whole lot because, quite honestly, as a fisheries biologist, when you do a rehab project, you don't need to count an increase in fish when it was completely horrible to completely wonderful. You basically don't waste your time with that. You know how good it is. But because there are people that want to know those numbers, we do have to document them. So we eventually finished a CREO program not too long ago, a major statewide one. Upper right-hand corner here, basically after if we do a rehabilitation project on a reservoir, it supports at least 5 to 6 times the amount of fishing effort that a non-rehab reservoir of the same age does. So that was something we can point to, a lot of social benefits, economic benefits, stuff like that. From the actual biology of the community themselves, this is just a quick snapshot. Most of our, looking just only at largemouth bass, which is pretty important on our flood control reservoirs. Our pre-project numbers are basically real low, non-existent. We use, as an agency, 100. Once our largemouth bass numbers decrease to less than 100 fish per hour of electrofishing, we figure it's time to start doing something about that. So after we complete a project, 3 years afterwards, we jump clear up to this average of about 350, and then it stabilizes down, and we start getting much better size structure there. So we've got now a lot more documented evidence that they're important, and there's returns to these dollars that we actually invest. But quite honestly, the program is so popular we don't really need these, but we may sometimes. Sediment and nutrients, those are the 2 major problems that we face with our watersheds and stuff like that. But I also want to bring up shoreline erosion. Nebraska is a very windy place, so we have a lot of wind problems. We have a lot of problems within the reservoir. So from here on out, I'm going to talk about the techniques that we use actually to restore reservoirs. And basically all of our techniques address one of these 3 issues, or all 3 in combination. Usually our first step in any rehabilitation project is to work in the watershed. We will start usually with a cooperative effort with our local water quality, Nebraska's DEQ, which uses EPA funds. We'll work with NRCS, local landowners, county boards. We have natural resource districts, things like that. Start a community-based planning program where we actually go look at the watershed, look at where we have critical impairments in the watershed, where are we getting our sediments from, how much is loading into the reservoir, where can we go out and do work in the watershed to stop that amount of sediments and nutrients washing into the reservoir. That's our main thing that we try to do. After we do that, then we actually focus on working on in-lake work. And again, Aquatic habitat dollars cannot be used in the watershed. They can only be used in the lake itself to sustain the fish population. So I can't use it to do a cost share to improve soil management practices in the watershed, like buying no-till drills, building buffer strips and stuff like that. Generally, those are federal dollars. Every federal dollar needs a state match. We try to bundle these projects as entire watershed projects so that my state dollars used in the reservoir itself can be matched against the federal dollars being used in the watershed as a package. So that's one of the ways we've gotten a little more creative in trying to get some more federal dollars attracted to our program. This is Wagon Reservoir, rehabilitated a number of years ago. What I want to look at here is this upper end. If we just flipped around right here, right after the reservoir was built, we always try to make, because we can't get all of it. You're still going to have loading into a watershed reservoir. You're always going to have that. It's a certain amount of sediment. They've already been deposited in the stream channels. They've already been deposited in these reservoirs, so if you can't take it out, you got to stop more coming in. So we try to get creative. We try to have retention dikes and things like that to slow down the runoff rates into our reservoirs. We tried our first couple experiments actually doing up in the watershed. The problem with that is that we ran into a real problem with permitting and mitigation, and we were using all of our dollars in the watershed above the water level here, which wasn't really benefiting the fisheries. So we backed out, and we now basically go into the reservoir itself, and we'll sacrifice surface area, which quite honestly was crap anyway because it was 6 inches deep and nothing left. We'll dig it out, and we'll build these retention cells. So we have water coming in here. It has a 1-stage cell, 2-stage cell, then drops into here. These are just protection from south winds to help break up all this here. But this is right after. This was a huge rain event that came right after we finished constructing it. It's hard to see, but basically we have most of our sediment dropping out here, a little more here, then it slowly goes into here. What we're really hoping to do when we build these retention cells is to get a nice finishing wetland in there, which will actually handle the nutrients. Not only will it drop out the sediment, the heavy particles, then it polishes off the nutrients. This is this section right here 5 years later. This is a wetland that's been established, so now we have much better water quality up here. When we built these retention structures, we do it more than just to stop the sediment and obviously pull out nutrients. We also want to make it fish friendly. This here is a reservoir in southeast Nebraska. This entire area in red was basically all sedimented in, filled in with sediment. It used to be underwater at one time when the reservoir was first built. So what we've done is removed an awful lot of this sediment out here, piled it in islands, hauled it out. This is a huge mountain over here of sediment. Then we're addressing what comes in here as inloads. Here's a little rock structure down here. There's a bigger dike right here. These are kind of unique here, something we've learned how to do eventually. When the stream comes in, you want to force it to meander, because when a stream meanders, it loses energy, drops sediment and silt right here. And we built these structures so you can draw the reservoir down 2 feet, get a piece of heavy equipment on there, and dig this out. So not only are we building it to restore it to its earlier lifespan, we're also making so you can actually maintain it on a regular basis. The other thing, we do a lot of these little check structures real close to reservoirs. It's surprising how much benefit they do. You can see in the background just a little ag field right there. It was real close to this reservoir. A little rock gabion right here, and you can see the difference in water quality when it runs right here, between here and here. Little things like that we've learned over time. Eventually we get into a reservoir, and we've done all the nutrient controls we can, but there's a huge load of internal nutrients. It's deposited over years, so we have to either take it out, or if we can't take it out for whatever reason, we try to apply it. This is Carter Lake, Iowa. Mike and I did a cooperative project on this a number of years back. This is an alum treatment. You actually spray this material. It's like pickling juice. And will actually bind with phosphorus, which drives a lot of our harmful algal blooms, and it'll bind and it'll flocculate to the bottom. So that's one way of doing it. It really only works in a situation where you have a lot of internal loading and not external loading. And this is what you can do, is you can go really cloudy water to this kind of water clarity relatively overnight. One thing we've learned over time too is that the guys who make and manufacture and sell alum tell you that all the magic's in the alum itself. We learned early on as fish biologists, if you change the fish community at the same time, remove your rough fish community, the ones that are uprooting vegetation and stuff like that, it really works synergistically with the alum application itself. So this is actually Carter Lake again. We did a fish renovation right here. So we actually started with an alum treatment in April, and we improved water clarity from about 6 inches to about 3.5 foot, major difference for alum. And then we did a fish renovation that fall, and next year we have 18 foot of water clarity. So there's a real synergistic effect of those two techniques. So once you get them into your reservoirs, what do you do with it? Well, in most cases, we try to take out as much as we can. I think it's pretty uniform that you'll never be able to take out as much as it accumulated. You just can't afford it. Removing material out of a reservoir can, if you can do it in the dry, runs between $2 and $4 a cubic yard. If you've got to hydraulically dredge it, it can be either $6 to $18 a cubic yard. If you've got really wet conditions where you have to use specialized equipment, they run somewhere in between. Most of our reservoirs that I've seen that we're working on now have accumulated anywhere between 100,000 to 1.5 million cubic yards of material over the life of the reservoir. The reservoir was built for that purpose. It's doing its job. It just makes it really tough on fish habitat and very expensive to go after, but we can find a way to do it. I just took this a couple days ago. Some of the old reservoirs that were built, this is actually an urban lake, they were actually just built too shallow. You know, that's where fishery science comes in, tells you the depth and the structure of your lake, makes a big difference in the fish community you can support. A lot of old urban lakes were built 3 to 5 foot deep. They just wanted a pond. It looked pretty. They didn't understand why fish died every year. In Nebraska and South Dakota and Iowa, we have ice, and if it freezes to the bottom, the fish don't like being frozen. And so we lost them. So here's an example of where we're going in not just to remove the sediments that accumulated, we're actually digging this reservoir deeper. We're sacrificing surface area for depth. So this is a little urban lake that's 29 acres. When we get done, it's going to be 20 acres, and we're adding 8 foot of depth to the bottom of the lake. So it's now going to have to be 14 foot deep at the deepest, some 12 foot, 8 foot, so on and so forth. Zonation, a lot of basin sculpting. Now that makes sense in a lot of my flood control reservoirs. Quite honestly, with our flood controls, we're pretty lucky. If you go to that managing agency, BLM, Corps of Engineers, they built a flood control structure. They build it for a purpose to hold flood control stuff. Well, you go up to them and say, I'd like to drain your lake. They say, well, how is that going to affect our flood control abilities? You can hold a lot more. Okay, go do whatever you want. We don't care. They're fine with that. So if you can drain them down, you can do an awful lot of work. And that's quite honestly how we started our program, learning how to do a lot of techniques by draining these lakes and basically starting over. You know, protecting shorelines, building fish habitat, basin sculpting. That's how we started off. But quite honestly, in Nebraska, we have a lot of big reservoirs too. And these are big irrigation reservoirs that fluctuate anywhere between 10 feet a year to 30 feet a year, sometimes even more for irrigation drawdown annually. And it's never in a way that quite honestly benefits vegetation or fish habitat. So we have an awful lot of areas. We have huge 30, 60, 80, 100-foot cliffs where the shorelines have just been beat up by either the fluctuating water level, wind-driven waves, things like this. This here's almost 300 feet, top to bottom here. How do you go about addressing that on the scale? Because you can't go just pull the lake down and say, I'd like to have you pull it down 10 feet for the next 6 months. Would you please? They basically say, no, this was built for irrigation. This is built for hydrogen. We're going to operate here. If you want to work within our schedule, we'll allow you to, but we're not going to change operations for you. So then you have to get a little creative on doing that. And here's an example. This is Yankee Hill. This is a flood control reservoir we basically drew down. Here's the old existing dam structure. That's the only rock that was there before we got there. After we got done with it, we basically dug a bunch of it out. We protected all these shorelines here, which usually get beat up, create all this fish habitat back here, coves back here, breakwaters, different spawning habitat, vegetative materials. A point we dug out, underwater shoals, stuff like that. That's what we can do in a flood control. And we get real creative on our flood controls over the years. You know, we try to build these with two things in mind to do the job. This is a reservoir that's a north-south leg. We have mostly north and south winds in the state of Nebraska. It basically runs 3 degrees off center, north to south. In the wintertime, it comes one direction. Summertime, it goes the other direction. It goes back and forth. So the most important thing here is to protect wind-driven waves and beating up this shore and all these shorelines. So these little kickouts right here are basically meant to attenuate that waves. When the waves get close to the shoreline, they basically hit those wave structures. They cast a shadow of protection, basically 4 to 1 on this depth here, this way here. So you get a shadow behind all these, which allows the reestablishment of shallow vegetation, spawning habitat, and then we try to make sure that we have little access trails to get on top here so people can go fish on top of them. So that way we can benefit our anglers. You can see here's our sediment retention deck on the bottom. Water comes in here, it gets stops out, improves water clarity. This protects it from the lake. So we've done an awful lot of that. We've got, quite honestly, our flood control reservoirs, we got figured out. We pretty much can go back and restore it, and we can turn back the clock. We can take it back to at least as good a habitat as it was when it first filled up. These bigger reservoirs, like I said, is the real problem. That's where we're more of a challenge now. And we can do it. We've learned how to do it over the last 5 to 10 years. The problem is it's just very expensive, and you have to work on a different timetable. And here's a couple of examples of reservoirs. This here is Harlan Reservoir. The years are across the bottom. This is actually elevation, so don't think about that a year. That's elevation. This is yearly changes in elevation in that reservoir from 1980 to 2008. If you're going to say, I'm going to build a structure that has a top at this level right here, look at all the years it would be either overtopped or undertopped. It's a really hard moving target in those big reservoirs. A couple of good examples. Here's a point. This is at low water right here. So this is a point Because of the wind, it beats the heck out of it. You can see it's really eroded all the way back. This one here is a cove. Because of lateral points being degraded, it cuts off the cove. So important habitat in the cove that's being cut off and lost with time. So our job is to try to go back in there and fix that. Here's the same reservoir. It's a little bit different point. I wanted to throw this up here so it's a little easier to see at full water. But what we had to do is this area right here, we basically spent a year doing nothing but buying rock and hauling it in. We stockpiled this big bunch of rock, and then the year they were allowed to draw it down as much as they could for a maintenance thing, we went in and built these offshore breakwaters here and here. So these tips of these here are on almost 25 foot of water. So what we've done is we've created shallow water habitat, we've protected this point, and we've actually got fishing access. Guys can walk out here a little ways. That's one way of doing it. For example, you have some parts of your reservoir you can't do all your shoreline, so you have to protect it, and quite honestly, energy basically learns itself. Waves come in, take off these taller banks, come down here, and they basically create a beaching slope on the way out. So when waves come in, they actually trip on themselves. So they basically self-correct. What we do here, just lay a toe cap down the bottom right here. What that does is it saves this bank. Vegetation goes up back here, and basically we have clearer water in front of it. Sometimes they're very expensive. This breakwater here is 35 feet top to bottom. It's all rock. This was a one we built in the wet. This reservoir can only go down 5 feet, so the water can only drop down to here. So we had a contractor start back here and start filling in rock, compacting his way down all the way out here. This was built in the wet. So that's what it is now. It's all rock. We use geotubes occasionally. They're pretty expensive, but they can be used if you have almost no rock or it's very expensive to get rock there. You have a dredge and lots of sand. You can fill those tubes up, and then you can reduce the amount of rock you put on top. You can plan around them. All this work that we have to do, and Mike alluded to it, you have to get permits, you have to get construction permits, easements, things like that. Most of those permits will not be issued unless you have a set of stamped documents. So in this case here, we actually hire engineers. These are usually civil engineers working with our biologists to try to find ways to make these reservoirs better. And we have to use their drawings, get them professionally stamped, submit with part of our permits. Then we get our permit, then we get our funding, and we can do our project. But you can use an example here. This dotted line is the old existing bottom. So we're building a breakwater. This shows structurally the slopes, types of material, compaction factors that we use to go in here. Then we often talk about fish habitat, different aspects around here. Here's a little hump. We'll actually, this was the old bottom right here, an old creek channel that filled in. We'll dig it all the way back out, put a little rock hump here, undulating shoals on the backside, make it easier to fish. This is an offshore breakwater. This is the area that used to be all filled in. We dig it back out so we can get vegetation growing back in here. One thing that biologists have known for a long time, and we've been doing it for years as well as agency biologists, is brushing. You know, we're lucky in Nebraska. It gets colder and heck in the winter, so years we have a lot of good ice. A lot of times we'll go cut cedar trees, drag them on the ice. When the ice melts, they drop down, do a pretty decent job. When we started doing our rehab projects and draining this reservoir all the way down, we could do it big time then. We actually would get a lot of our bass clubs. We would spend a day with chainsaws cutting down trees and guys dragging them with pickups down into the bottom. Then we spend another day blocking them down. The water comes back out and you've got a really nice vegetated coat. The other thing that we've done with time, and our biologists are slowly getting better at this, is they start taking the opportunities when they do maintenance around these areas. This is an example of an old shelter belt that had to be removed because of an expansion project of a road not too far down from the reservoir. They knew the reservoir was going down. They had them salvage all the stumps. There's this guy here, Phil. He's not very tall. But those are pretty good-sized stumps, and we basically laid this across the mouth of a cove for habitat, but also for wind protection to come back into the shoreline. We also are getting a little more creative, and we're learning more. If we clear an area off, we can take the old brush, tie it down, make it kind of a nice little nursery habitat, a lot of small spaces when the water comes back up. And the bigger clearing and grubbing, if you're an engineer and you're a contractor, you get anywhere between $30 and $300 to clear a tree like that off. And basically use a piece of heavy equipment and it's based on your girth. That's how they bid these things out. So what we started saying, if you're going to charge us that much to take a tree out, you're going to leave these trees here just like this because we're going to use them in the lake. And so we start getting more creative. And Ben will probably recognize this because this is an idea I explained to Steve one day, and he was working on a project. He had a bunch of these logs and goes, Rockstar? Sounds like an interesting kind of a habitat thing. And so he was talking with the contractor. The contractor goes, yeah, I'll build that for you. So he's using heavy equipment to build this Rockstar. They sketch it out. And the next day, the contractor says, well, I'll build that sucker for you. Within the reservoirs, we try to do an awful lot of stuff with rock, obviously, because of our wind and our fertile, fragile soils. We've got to do a lot of shoreline protection. But now, when we do that, we don't just rock an entire shoreline. We basically have all these little bump outs for wind protection, but angler access. Within them, we'll put down gravel shoals for attractors. In our bigger reservoirs, this is just different types of cobble for walleye, white bass congregation. A lot of our near shore stuff, we try to get some sculpting in. Again, here's a little kick out angler. We dig out next to it, throw some gravel around it, throw some brush piles out here. Just makes it funner to fish closer to shore. Big reservoir drawdown, we had a bunch of concrete come up from an old runway that was being disabled, and so they gave us the rock, we just had to haul it in. These are 4 to 5 foot tall. There's a guy standing right there. Throw them in there. These basically now take a point that was once very smooth and denuded, put this artificial structure on top, makes it much more attractive for fishing. Here's a channel that we're working on. It's a canal. It's all lined with rock. It's not that great of a fishery until you start throwing these little current deflectors in the bottom of there, and also those fish start stacking up in here. When you go back, you see anglers just all standing right here fishing that deflector. So the more of those you put in, the more fishing success you have. Some of the very, very first things we started with a lot of years ago was Ajax. And this is something, gosh, the very beginning of our program, we were trying to figure out ways to stabilize the shoreline, and we didn't want to just rock it, because that wasn't doing a whole lot for fish habitat. We thought, oh gosh. On the coast, they use these things every once in a while. And these are basically wave attenuators. You stick them in the bottom of a thing, and as a wave hits it, kind of it diffuses the energy, and you can tell that behind these breakwaters is very still water. So it does a good job of breaking up waves. They're very expensive, and you got to have. They're tough to put together. These are come in single pieces on a semi. You got to epoxy them together, then use a crane to set them in place just like that. So they're very intensive to do. So quite honestly, they're not really cost-effective time-wise. But over the years, willows grow into them, and this is a fantastic flathead catfish fishery. The cavies sitting there, these are a lot of trophy catfish that we have in there because of that. And it still protects the shoreline. We've done a lot of projects. When we get involved, it's all in. We have to for a couple of reasons. These things are so far gone that they are providing very little fishing value. We get complaints, and we know the importance of recreational fishing in our state. It's an important local driver of our communities and economies, so we've done that. And we've been very fortunate since 1997 to have an awful lot of support. Right now our program is very popular. We have plenty of money, short of people and time, and we can go in and do big projects. And we're spending a lot of our time now not just doing our rehab list, ones that are approved, we're also working with other groups to build new reservoirs in a similar manner with all these different little functions built into them like we have here, with fish and fishing in mind. So it's been a great generator for us, and it's something that we know the importance of reservoirs, like Jeff mentioned. If the National Fish Habitat, from a national perspective, they're not real keen on reservoirs, but they are really overlooking the fact how important the economies and what this does to people. This really helps an awful lot of businesses. It's very supportive of groups. Homeowners love them, trail users love them, picnickers love them. Even if they don't fish 100 days a year, if they can go there once or twice a year, take their grandkids and have fun fishing, it's an important thing. With that, I will stop, and if you have any questions, I'm here for the rest of the time.